Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a wonderful blessing to be here today. I'd like to see if you would turn with me to the book of John, chapter 1. The Gospel of John. I want to commend you to the messages that our brother Philip Shoemate gave to us this past week, from Sunday of last week to Wednesday of this week, or last week as well, and to think about very carefully and with great diligence and prayer how steadfast you and I should be in living in this world as Christians. And I also want to commend to you, those of you that are members here and those of you that are visiting, to come and attend the Bible class on Sunday morning and Wednesday night in auditorium, specifically for the adults. You're going to hear some things that are going to be needful for you to prepare to give yourself an answer, as David was directing us in our attention this morning in class, that I must tell you is so vital. It is absolutely essential, without a doubt, that you go back to the beginning. For there are people that don't know the true meaning of going to the beginning. They'd rather just dismiss the beginning and just talk about where we are and just make our best way. But the beginning has so many essential elements to it that need our attention. I appreciate, too, the songs that we just got through singing that Manley was leading us on grace, because that has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about here in the book of John chapter 1. So begin with me in verse 10, where it says, "He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world knew him not. He came into his own, and they that were his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he the right to become children of God, even to them that believe on his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bare witness of him, and cried and said, This was he of whom it is said, He that comes after me is become before me, for he was before me. For his fullness we all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." One thing that I wish I had time to go through and talk about, to see Jesus in the beginning of this chapter was with God in the beginning. In verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But then you get into a little bit more about Jesus by it saying in verse 3 that everything that exists comes from him. And without him, none of this would happen. None of these would be made. There is a lot to be said for this man named John coming along and testifying of these things and witnessing of this. And the illumination, as he states here in verse 8, he was not the light, John was not the light, but came that he might bear witness of the light. So he's introducing Jesus, the Christ, as the light of the world. And Jesus is going to say, I am the light of the world. But you notice in verse, where it says in verse 16, in verse 14, that when Jesus came as the Word in the flesh, dwelling among us, he was the one that was full of grace and truth. Grace, there's a lot of people that's kind of put a few words to the word grace and picked out certain letters of the word. And so a grace is God's righteousness at Christ's expense, or God's riches at Christ's expense. Some have even talked about how it's God's resources at Christ's expense. But all in all, what you've got here in the book of John chapter 1 is us understanding that everything about Jesus, all grace, all truth, is a means of identification. It's identifying who he is. Now, before Jesus has ever said, I am, and the book of John has a lot of these, I am the light of the world, I am the bread of life, I am the truth, the way, You know some of those words that he mentions here. Before he even says this, you've got Jesus identifying himself in John chapter 1. All these things that pertain to truth and grace. When you see the idea of Jesus being full of grace and of truth, sometimes there's a tendency to try to put a balancing act on these two things. And maybe we seem to have the tendency to move toward one than toward the other. We're going to talk about the idea of grace this morning, and we're going to talk about the idea of Jesus being all truth this evening. And it's not, I'm going to try to put a balancing act on Jesus. I'm going to just emphasize clearly that Jesus is full of all grace, and Jesus is full of all truth. It's not he's partial this, partial that. He's full of both. He's full of both. It's just like he's full of being God. You just don't dismiss certain aspects of God and say, well, he didn't have this, he didn't have that. But every aspect of God is Jesus in the flesh. That's what verse 14 says. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So you just don't dismiss grace to talk about truth, and you don't say truth and dismiss grace. You want to make sure you've got all this information. Let's just face it. It's because of grace we have truth. Because of truth, we wouldn't know grace. So those two things go together. They're vital aspects of all that we need to know and need to be when it comes down to understanding Jesus. I am all of this. So I want to talk with you a little bit about how this man, Jesus Christ, is all grace. All grace. And to approach this, first of all, I want to talk about how sometimes there's a tendency to think about it in terms of entitlement rather than think about it in terms of grace. Specifically, when you look at John, the first chapter, verse 12. In John 1, verse 12, as we read a while ago, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right. Some versions, the King James Version, use the word power to become children of God, even to them that believe on his name. So now we've got a very clear understanding. But if you take that word right in our terminology, or I should say in the current cultural terminology of right, then that's almost like an entitlement. That you've got a certain thing that you are entitled to be or to have or to be able to do. Constitutional rights. And as a result of the observance of and really impressing upon people's mind constitutional rights, we've come to the point of sometimes inserting it in the scriptures and thinking that we've got this right to be whatever we want to be. Because of God's grace, that will cover everything. But that's a foreign teaching of what the true concept of grace is. Grace, to be children of God, is the favor that God bestows upon us through this word, Jesus becoming flesh. None of us, according to Romans chapter 5, verse 6 to verse 8, Romans chapter 3, verse 23, well, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. None of us have been so good, so overwhelmingly favored by God that God says, okay, I'm going to send Jesus to the world for you, to dwell among you. It's because of the sin that exists is why Jesus came to the world. Think about it in these terms. In John the 3rd chapter, John 3 verse 16, very familiar verse to a lot of people where it talks about God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Why is it that Jesus is coming? He is going to be the illumination that verse 19, 20, and 21 of the same chapter discusses illuminating the world in their darkness, of which exposes the fact that they're undeserving people, you and me. That Jesus comes to the world in all grace and all favor from God, bestowing upon you and I means of salvation and redemption. Not because we were so great and so good that all this comes. If you look at it from the standpoint of John 3, verse 17 and 18, that Jesus did not come to judge the world. God could have said Jesus came in all judgment and executioner. For those people did not deserve to be saved, nor to be justified, nor to be redeemed. They're all enemies. They're all wicked and sinful people. When I alluded to just a moment ago, the text in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, where it says, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, right after that, there are two big words that he uses in reference to what's done by God's grace for those people that have sinned. The one word is justification. The other word is sanctification. Justified, sanctified. Two terms that bring about God's grace to the people that are undeserving, you and me. That's all Jesus did. We know that John 3:16 says he gave his only begotten Son, and Jesus gave everything he had for us. According to Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 to verse 8, he emptied himself of where he was in heaven so that he could come here to give all of himself for us. But what is it that we need to understand? We need to understand that we did not deserve any of this and the right to receive this sacrifice. That's what Titus chapter 2, verse 11 is all about. For the grace of God came teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly and righteously and godly in this present world. All those texts there that I've mentioned to you, Romans chapter 3, verse 21 to verse 24, helps you understand a little bit more about why Paul would say what he says in Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5 verse 1 to verse 2 talks about being justified by faith. But as you go into that text, he helps you understand that there was not a single person in the world, according to verse 6, that was so worthy of this sacrifice that God said, I can't help myself, I guess I just got to send my Son to them. It was because we were enemies. That word enemies, very descriptive term of the undeserving people of which God's grace comes on through Jesus Christ and everything that Jesus is. Beginning in verse 12 of the book of Romans chapter 5 through the end of the chapter, he introduces just exactly what man was leading us in a while ago, how this marvelous, infinite, matchless grace is so abundant and overwhelming in Jesus that it will do everything possible to eliminate the trespasses and sins of people. It's already done that. And it all came through Jesus Christ. All right, now here's an interesting thing that you and I must understand. When this grace comes, do we, or I should say has come in Jesus, do we fully appreciate it? Is the appreciation of this grace really manifested in us? Let's go to Romans chapter 6. After introducing you to what the theme and understanding of Romans chapter 5 is about, right after he says all that he says about this, in verse 21, even so sin reigned in death, even so might grace reign through righteousness unto eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. You're thinking, oh, this is a wonderful solution to the problem. All right, once the removal of the sin takes place through the possibilities of the grace, then where is the appreciation? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? And the infinite imperative exclamation, God forbid, that people think that way. That they will just be able to do whatever, say whatever, think whatever, just to have any kind of religious thought that they want, and everything will be okay. We who died to sin, how shall we any longer live therein? Or are we ignorant therein of all who are baptized in Christ were baptized into his death? This appreciation now comes in the form of us, of this grace, is service. Think about it from the standpoint of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. In 1 Corinthians 15 verse 10, this is a statement that I heard that was stated by a gentleman many, many years ago who was a recovering alcoholic. He used this in reference to himself, and rightly so, because he believed he was undeserving of any grace of God. because of his redeeming opportunity to be a child of God by saying, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. By the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace, which was bestowed upon me, was not found in vain. Now that phrase, not found in vain, is just giving you a clear understanding. It was not sent by Jesus in all that he did to say, okay, you do what you want to do, it's still there, and you're going to be found in favor. In other words, you're going to be entitled to this. Verse 10 declares and implies appreciation for the grace that was sent by God in Jesus in its fullness to all of us. Like Colossians chapter 2, verse 9 and verse 10 talks about the fullness of it. In Colossians 2, verse 9 and 10, you and I must understand this fullness of grace in Jesus. Immediately after that statement is made, he says you and I can be full in him. And that's exactly what you witness in all that Paul states in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 10. You don't want to receive, in other words, you don't want this grace to come in vain. Maybe I can illustrate this way. I don't want to show of hands, but how many times has it been that you have given something to someone as a gift, not because they deserved it or anything that they did wonderful things of achievement that caused you to say, I can't help myself, I just got to go get this gift for them. But you just gave it to them just because you wanted to give it to them. As a result of that, you give it to them, and then you learn a little bit later that they either wore it or they used it only one time. And they just discarded it, they hung it back up in the closet, or in some cases they may have just returned it. Or they gave it away to somebody else. How many of you, knowing that that would have been the case, view that as a disrespect of your grace and gift and say, I will never do that again. I will never do that again to anybody, especially to that person. It's almost like they received the gift in vain. They didn't like it, didn't appreciate it, didn't want it. They didn't have it. They just took one time and did it. Let me just let you understand, the concept of this once saved, always saved is absolutely blown out of the water when people understand what's going on in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 10. The appreciation of the grace is you just don't find yourself saved and experience the fullness of Jesus and you just go out and do whatever it is you want to do. He says, I didn't want this to be found as something that came from God and it's vanity. It's empty, it's useless. In the book of Acts chapter 13, you got an example of this. And I'm going to come back to 1 Corinthians 15 in just a minute. But in Acts chapter 13, this is after there is this great message in Antioch of Pisidia by Paul here referring to the history of the people of Israel. And in verse 42, as they went out, they besought that these words might be spoken to them the next Sabbath. Now, when the synagogue broke up, many of the Jews and the devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, urged them to continue in the grace of God. It's not a one-time gift, and you accept that, and that's all. You continue in this. For example, in the book of Acts chapter 20, in the message that Paul is delivering to the elders at Ephesus, he's delivering to them this message, and he says, I want to commend you. This is verse 32. I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to be received once, and that is sufficient. He says, the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and to give you the inheritance among all them that are sanctified. Again, it's back to that sanctification that I talked about in Romans chapter 3, of which that's the resolution to the people that are sinning and have sinned in Romans chapter 3, 23. This sanctification is setting you apart to say, okay, now you stay in this grace and you show your appreciation for it. Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Let's look and see the appreciation of Paul in verse 10. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace which was bestowed upon me was not found in vain. But I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. The grace of God brought about a salvation that he would even talk about in one of the books of Timothy in the first chapter. But this grace of God in its appreciation is the continuing in it, the laboring, knowing that the grace of God would continue. It's just like verse 16 of John 1 says, grace upon grace. And I don't know the numbers of the times. I don't know. I haven't counted them. You could go back and we can sit down and talk about it. The numbers of times of which Paul introduced a book to Christians, to a church, and ended the book using the word grace. Knowing that God's grace is upon them in the beginning of the book, and then God's grace be with you at the end of the book. It was said over and over and over again. And these are to people that are already children of God. Why would you say that? Because the grace is just as essential for them after they're child of God than it is before. So therefore, this is so significant to understand the value of this. Especially when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 10, where he says, by the grace of God that was with me. Soak that in, folks. Grab a hold of that and digest that. Hold on to it and never let it go. Because God's grace, his fullness of grace continues with you on and on. Even to the point of helping you in temptation. In the book of Hebrews chapter 4, Hebrews chapter 4, you'll notice that in verse 14, we have a high priest, a great high priest who hath passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we have not a high priest that cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but one that has been in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore draw near with boldness under the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and may find grace to help us in time of need. Now again, I'm referring back to the idea of Jesus being full of grace. If Jesus being full of grace is just a one-time thing, which initially comes at your salvation, and that's really the only time that you're going to have to consider it, then why verse 14 through verse 16 of Hebrews chapter 4? It is because temptation does not cease after you become a child of God. It just keeps coming. It's just thrown at you at all kinds of directions, trying to get you back to where you used to be before you received this grace and obedience to him by faith. And again, if I were to ask for a show of hands, I would say that a lot of you probably know very clearly that after you become a child of God, I was tempted by this and by this and by this and by this. Okay? How do you handle that? What do? If the grace doesn't come as a means of a solution to the temptation, then what do you pull from? Well, I'm educated. I've got a degree. I've experienced. I've got skill, talent. I'm used to this kind of thing. I've been exposed to it before. You can tell me all the things you want to. But in Hebrews chapter 4, the fullness of the grace of God comes in Jesus as the high priest in his fullness, providing you the grace from heaven that you need in the midst of the temptation. That's why 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13 says what it says. There's no temptation taken you but such as common to man. But there's a way of escape. Where'd that come from? Came by God's grace that you needed to overcome the temptation. And the trials are no different. Disease, persecution, ridicule, mockery, trials of life, pressures. Where do you handle all those difficulties? This is what Paul did. In the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and please know this, there are a lot of folks, and some of which in this audience this morning, that are dealing with difficulties every single day. And you may wonder, how can they deal with that? What's the resource? Paul had a difficulty in verse 7 and 8. And as a result of the difficulties which he's handling, he asked God 3 times that it would depart. In verse 9, he says, "Unto me my grace is sufficient for thee, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in weakness than the power of Christ may rest upon me. Wherefore I take pleasure in weakness, injuries, necessities, persecutions, distresses, for the sake of Christ." For the sake of Christ, what's he going to give you? He's going to give you his grace. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. All the fullness of Christ that was brought at the salvation of man is the fullness of Christ with his grace that brings you to the point of dealing with trials. Every one of them. This is why 1 Peter 5 verse 7 says, "Cast all your anxiety upon him because he cares for you." Come to the throne of grace. Come to where the information, where the comfort, where the care, where the strength, all that you need comes from heaven. Come here. This is what you need. That's how those people handle those temptations. That's how those people handle those trials. God's grace upon them. Well, what will this cause us to do? What will this grace that helps us through these trials and temptations, what will it cause us to do? Well, it will help us to serve. You see that all through what Paul is talking about. One of the places that I would like for you to look at is Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, you see this grace that is given after he says, okay, all of us need to be sacrifices, verse 1 and verse 2. We don't need to be conformed to the world anymore, but we need to be transformed. But watch what he says right after that. I want to say, through the grace that was given to me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God has dealt to each man a measure of faith. Even as we have many members in one body, and all the members have not the same office, so we who are many are one body in Christ and several members one of another. We've got all these people full of grace. Isn't that a little bit too much? Isn't that overwhelming? No. What it brings about is verse 6. Having gifts differing according to the grace given to us, whether prophecy, let us prophesy by the proportion of faith. Ministry, let us give ourselves to ministry. He that teaches to his teaching. He that exhorts to his exhorting. He that gives, let him do it with liberality. He that rules with diligence. He that shows mercy with cheerfulness. And I cannot hesitate but to say, from the beginning of verse 9 to the end of chapter verse 21, you've got all these key pieces to be inserted in your life that is a demonstration of the fullness of grace in Jesus to us to serve. It's not deserving, it's serving that's so significant here. Not that I deserve anything, it's now God's given me an opportunity, since I'm now saved by his grace, to be full of grace through Jesus Christ to serve him. Because other people need to know it. Every Christian, according to what you see in the book of Titus chapter 2, that mentioned the grace of God was brought to all of us. Then in verse 14 is to present all of us an opportunity to see there's good works all of us can participate in every single day we live. Every single day. Grace to serve. Grace to help. Grace to be humble. Grace to remain. Grace to be steadfast. Grace to build up. Like Acts chapter 20 talks about. And therefore, as a result of that, this grace is not received in vain. Here is something I want you to think about with me. This grace to serve that is given by Jesus Christ is, I don't know if I can say this accurately or not, but it's sufficient and it's exceedingly abundant. To the point that every person that's a child of God has all that they need from God through Jesus to be all that God asked of them to be. And added to that is that the church, with all those people in it that are full of the grace of Jesus, can do the things that God wanted the church to do. And they don't need a business. They don't need another ministry. They don't need an organization. They don't need any other resource to bring about the fullness of the church in its sufficiency other than what grace is given to them. Because God has placed in Jesus the fullness of grace, and He extends that to all of us to say, you, according to Romans chapter 12 and verse 3 through verse 7, you've got a gift that's come by God's grace to use it in the family of God. Think about it in these terms. In the book of Ephesians, I just want to show you, this just overwhelms me to see how sufficient this grace is, exceedingly. In verse 20 of chapter 3, now unto Him, well, let me go back. Let me go back to verse 17. That Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, to the end that you being rooted and grounded in love may be strong to apprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and the length and the height and the depth. Now that just tells you the direction. And to know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge, that you may be filled unto all the fullness of God. That's identical to John chapter 1 verse 14, that God's fullness is in Jesus. Now, what's verse 20? Now unto Him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us, unto Him be the glory in the church, in Jesus Christ, in all generations, forever and ever. Exceedingly abundant. I got just enough time to give you just one little bit of Greek information that I came across. That phrase, exceedingly abundantly, is a word in the Greek, and if I got this right, it says huper ek perissos. Huper ek perissos. So you divide that up. Huper ek is ek and perissos. Huper is full. Ek is flowing. Limit. Full. I say full. I say flowing. Full. Perissos is flowing. Abundantly flowing. Think it in these terms. If it rains a lot and you're next to a creek, you look out there and see that creek is hooper. It's full of water. But then if that creek gets up to the point that it's reached its banks, then and it starts flowing over a little bit, and you say, well, it's Greek, you'd say hooper ek. It's full and it's over. But if that water that comes out of heaven reaches that creek next to your house and it gets not just full, but overflowing to the point that it reaches up to your house and in your house, you'd say that's perissos. Huper ek perissos. It can be full, it can be overflowing, and then it causes a flood. A flood. God is gives us His grace exceedingly abundantly. Huper ek perissos. It's way beyond what we deserve, and it's sufficient in all that it gives to us. It's overflowing. It will continue to help us in every aspect of what it is we do, to the point that when you get to the book of Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 28, he says, let us have grace. Let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. Serve God reverently and godly fear. That is an appreciation for the grace of God that's given to all of us in the fullness of Jesus. However many times we say we want to be like Jesus, you must also have in the back of your mind that this is saying that I want the fullness of grace of which He gives to me to handle temptation, trials, and to serve. And that with that, there's all sufficiency involved in it to help me with everything I need to be in service to His kingdom. Back in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when Paul was mentioning, I don't want to receive this grace in vain. And he didn't. But has this grace come to you and it's really been empty? It's void of any kind of help. You think it's not worth having. Or maybe you think you've got a better way of resolving the issues in your life. Don't receive this in vain when you know it's coming from heaven. This grace. If you think it's something you're going to be able to handle, then you might want to think about James chapter 4, verse 6. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And if you're a child of God, that you received this grace one time, however long ago it's been, and then you just actually received it in vain. You just gone off and done whatever you wanted to do. Then please know that grace provides you a means of removing that sin to where you don't have to stay there anymore. There are so many things of which this fullness of grace provides that we cannot dismiss. We cannot sit on a shelf to say, I'm glad it's there whenever I need it. Not right now, but some other time. You and I need the grace today and always. But there is Jesus full of truth that we want to talk about tonight. Well, what can we help you with this morning? Do what's right while together we sing this song.